The bill being debated is the Financial Administration and Audit Amendment Act 2026. It is brought by the Minister of Finance, Fayval Williams, to change how Jamaica's National Natural Disaster Reserve Fund, NNDRF, is funded and managed. In simple terms, the NNDRF is Jamaica's first response money pot for major natural disasters. It is meant to provide quick cash when hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, etc. hit and cause serious fiscal damage. The bill does three main things. It removes the $10 billion ceiling on how much money the NNDRF can hold in total. This became necessary because after Hurricane Melissa, Jamaica received disaster-related inflows far above $10 billion. The minister says, remove the cap on the maximum amount that may be held in the NNDRF.
I stand here before this Honourable House today to commence the debate on the bill entitled the Financial Administration and Audit Amendment Act 2026. Mr. Speaker, this bill seeks to amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act, the FAA Act, to remove the cap on the maximum amount that may be held in the National Natural Disaster Reserve Fund, NNDRF, cease mandatory annual transfers from the Consolidated Fund to the NNDRF once the balance is at or above $10 billion.
Hurricane Melissa resulted in an expected flow, well in excess of the $10 billion.
Mr. Speaker, Hurricane Melissa, having triggered several of these instruments, has resulted in an expected flow of resources well in excess of the $10 billion, the maximum legislated for the NNDRF.
She later notes the amount is approximately $115.7 billion.
It's important to note that as a result of the passage of Hurricane Melissa on October 28, 2025, the disaster coverage for Jamaica was well in excess of $10 billion at approximately $115.7 billion, Mr. Speaker.
And again clarified it.
Approximately $115.7 billion. No, this is the amount that we would expect to, when everything is said and done, that is the amount that would have flowed through that from all insurance, from our IFIs, from everywhere into that fund.
It stops mandatory budget contributions once the fund reaches $10 billion. This is the most controversial change. The minister states clearly, cease mandatory annual transfers from the Consolidated Fund once the balance is at or above $10 billion.
These mandatory annual transfers from the Consolidated Fund to the NNDRF once the balance is at or above $10 billion.
Mandatory annual transfers cease once the NNDRF is at or above $10 billion.
Mr. Speaker, the proposed amendment will seek to remove the cap of $10 billion, the maximum that currently applies to the amount that can be held in the NNDRF, and that the mandatory annual transfers from the Consolidated Fund cease once the NNDRF is at or above $10 billion.
In the clause-by-clause explanation, not less than $400 million annually, so that no issue would be required that would result in the NNDRF exceeding $10 billion.
In other words, Mr. Speaker, this amendment proposes the deletion of the aforementioned provision and to replace same with a provision that states that the NNDRF shall be funded with issues from the Consolidated Fund principal bank account such that the amount is not less than $400 million annually, so that no issue would be required of an amount that would result in the NNDRF exceeding.
It removes outdated provisions requiring payments for years when the fund was not operational. Remove Section 13A(1)(a)(i), transfer of $200 million during financial year 2023-24,
Which makes provision for the transfer of $200 million from the Consolidated Fund to the NNDRF during the financial year 2023-2024. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, because the NNDRF was neither approved nor operational during that financial year.
So the real policy shift is move away from relying on the national budget to build the disaster fund and rely more on insurance, catastrophe bonds, and international financing instruments. Now, why did Prime Minister Andrew Holness step in? Because Mark Golding was attacking the core philosophy behind the bill, not just the drafting. Golding's position was, climate change means disasters are increasing in scale and risk. We've had 2 in 2 years, climate change, confronting us.
And my question, when I read it, is why are we keeping a cap? In other words, we know that we're susceptible to these deadly or devastating natural disasters. We've had 2 in 2 years. We know that global warming and climate change are realities that are going to be confronting us in years to come.
Stop contributions is imprudent. Once you reach 10 billion, you no longer have to make contributions. Is that prudent?
We're also saying that once you reach 10 billion, you no longer have to make any contributions from the budget to this fund. And I'm just wondering whether that's prudent. I would have thought that we should, given the era we're in, we should continue to have the discipline of making these contributions annually, especially since there's no obligation to reimburse the fund. I can't find it anyway. I've looked. I don't see where in 13.8 it says if you draw down on the fund because there's been a disaster which has to be dealt with, there's no obligation to top it back up over a certain number of fiscal years or anything of that nature. You don't have to make contributions out of the budget of at least $400 million a year on an ongoing basis, regardless of whether the fund has reached 10 billion or not. That's really my question for you. Speaking for myself, I think we should just delete the words in the bill that come after the word annually in paragraph A and continue to contribute $400 million a year to this fund on an ongoing basis, regardless of where the amount is. Because 10 billion, as we've seen, is totally inadequate to address the likely consequences of any serious natural disaster. So contributions that can be made into this fund, or at least saying that once 10 billion is in there, the Consolidated Fund, we no longer have to make annual contributions from the budget to the fund of at least 400 million. I think that is no, I would say we must make those contributions every year.
There is
especially since there's no obligation to reimburse the fund. I can't find it anyway. I've looked. I don't see where in 13.8 it says if you draw down on the fund because there's been a disaster which has to be dealt with, there's no obligation to top it back up over a certain number of fiscal years or anything of that nature.
insurance and catastrophe bonds can fail.
The parametric insurance that we have is you can't say it's reliable. I mean, when Beryl hit, we didn't get a cent from the cat bonds, although the damage was very substantial. Your predecessor minister came here and explained the grid and the biometric pressure limits, and that we can't quite qualify it. So although we suffered many billions of dollars of damage, way in excess of 10 from Beryl, and indeed there are people still reeling from Beryl who have not fully recovered. You know, we didn't get a cent from the cat bond then. And so I think that one thing we can be sure of is self-reliance. And we ought to make an annual contribution in this era to the fund. And I'm going to propose that amendment, that all of the words following the word annually in the new paragraph A, which is in clause 2 of the bill, be deleted.
Jamaica must rely on itself. So Golding was saying, you are weakening Jamaica's self-insurance discipline and putting too much faith in uncertain external instruments. The Minister of Finance responded mainly from a technical financial angle. The budget has many demands. Our budget is required to do all kinds of things. Many calls on the budget.
But again, our budget is required to do all kinds of things. There are all kinds of calls on the budget. So if we are able to have our international partners, the global financial market, and all those entities help us to put together this framework and have it funded, I think it's a more disciplined way to go about having a national natural disaster risk financing resources at our disposal. And we saw how quickly those funds were able to be dispersed, and we are going to continue to build it out. We're looking at different types of instruments for different, not just for hurricanes, but for other types of disasters, so that we are ready in the event Jamaica is hit again by something. We're ready with the instruments that can quickly deploy and give us the needed finances to be able to begin the relief effort right away.
Jamaica now has a layered disaster financing framework
And found instruments, financial instruments, to bring into this framework of different, different nature. You saw in the instance of the global catastrophe bond that was issued on the international market. In the case of the CRIF, that was for a Caribbean partner who helped us with that facility. We pulled together as well our IFIs, international financial entities, and at the end of all that, we had a very robust national natural disaster financing framework, and the rest is history in terms of the performance of that fund, with the different layers that include, in the first instance, the government's own funds into the NNDRF. And we also had contingency fund, and then layered on top of that was the CRIF, IDB contingent facility, World Bank catastrophe bond, the global catastrophe bond, the IMF financing instrument. So,
external instruments provide more money than the budget can.
why are we keeping a cap from the funds flow from the Consolidated Fund? It's because of our ability to establish and to get way more financing otherwise than we
Golding's argument wasn't just financial. It was about national resilience and sovereignty over disaster preparedness.
So we will continue to look to search for different instruments for the fund. Just because the bond did not trigger last year in barrel, that doesn't mean that funds were not flowing in from other instruments. CRIF, there was funds that came from CRIF, there are funds that came from other instruments, and our preferred way as a government is to look for different types of instruments to put into this disaster risk financing framework so that we have surety about what we'll be able to receive.
Minister, I hear you. And I agree 100% that we need to have an array of different sources of relief to deal with natural disasters. And there are credit lines, there are these bonds, there are insurance policies, and there's a budget. Now, the point really is, why are we capping our contributions from the budget? Given that we know that whatever it is, the totality of what the coverage that we have is a fraction of the damage that these massive disasters can cause. The physical damage from Melissa has been quantified with reasonable accuracy at I think 8.8 billion US. That's the physical damage to Jamaican assets, private and public. Not to mention the non-physical losses, you know, the damage to business and the economy and so on. So the sum of the total of what you're expecting by way of flows for this fund, including the CAT bond and the credit lines and the CRIF insurance, etc., is $115 billion, which is not even 1 billion US. So it's not even, it's about 15% of the physical losses that the country has sustained. So to say that we're going to cover it in other ways is really fictional. And that is why I propose the amendment I have proposed. But anyway, the minister is not in favor of it. We can move on.
That is why the Prime Minister stepped in. Andrew Holness came in to defend the overall strategy of layered disaster financing, different funds for different levels of risk, insert fiscal discipline, explain why overfunding the reserve is risky, prevent the narrative careless, because Mark Golding was positioning himself as the voice of preparedness. The Prime Minister countered by saying,
Minister, if I could...
Prime Minister, your mic is on.
Thank you, Chairman. The Leader of the Opposition's point is not to be dismissed. And I interpret what he's saying to be that the National Disaster Risk Fund should be at its highest level possible. Nobody argues with that point. But remember the framework that we have, where we have different funds for different levels of risk. So the National Disaster Risk Fund is meant to be your first call, essentially, to deal with what is usually described as low-intensity, low-risk incidents that occur. And therefore, what the Ministry of Finance is trying to do is to gauge what that kind of low-intensity disaster, low-risk disaster would be. And then if you go past low-intensity disaster, then there is another kind of instrument that addresses it. And I think that they have come up with that framework, which works. So it's not that we don't want the fund to be huge, but remember, when we sequester funds from the Consolidated Fund, it increases the fiscal pressure because you can't use those funds for anything else other than disaster. So it's a balancing act, and I think that where we are with the threshold that we have set, we have struck the right balance. So it's not to dismiss the validity of the argument, but bear in mind what we have said. Taking funds out of the Consolidated Funds increases the fiscal pressure, and that there are other instruments and other financial arrangements that can be made to address frequency, intensity, and risk of other disasters.
At its core, this debate is about how Jamaica chooses to protect itself in an age where disasters are no longer rare events, but a structural feature of national life. The bill represents a strategic shift. Instead of steadily building up national savings through the budget as the backbone of disaster readiness, the government is saying that Jamaica should rely more heavily on external financial instruments, insurance payouts, catastrophe bonds, contingent credit lines, and rapid financing from international institutions. The budget becomes only one part of the system, not its foundation. That approach has logic. Jamaica's budget is limited and under constant pressure from debt service, social needs, and development priorities. Locking too much money into a reserve fund reduces flexibility and can weaken the government's ability to respond to everyday economic demands. The government's view that disaster financing is about leverage, using global markets and partners to multiply Jamaica's financial capacity far beyond what domestic savings alone could ever achieve. But the opposition's warning is equally logical. External instruments are not guaranteed. They depend on triggers, formulas, and market conditions. Sometimes they do not pay. Sometimes they pay late. Sometimes they pay far less than the damage caused. And when disasters strike, countries are often weakest financially and least attractive to lenders or investors. That is precisely when national self-reliance matters most. So the disagreement is not about whether insurance or international financing is useful. Everyone agrees they are necessary. The disagreement is about whether Jamaica should weaken the discipline of building its own financial cushion. By stopping mandatory budget contributions once a relatively modest threshold is reached, the state risks creating a false sense of security. The fund may look adequate on paper, but in reality it may be too small, too static, and too dependent on mechanisms that can fail at the worst possible time. This is why the Prime Minister stepped in. The issue had moved beyond a technical amendment and into the realm of national strategy. It was no longer about accounting rules. It was about sovereignty, resilience, and the philosophy of preparedness. The government was defending a model based on financial sophistication and global integration. The opposition was defending a model based on discipline, accumulation, and self-insurance. In that sense, this bill is not just about disaster finance. It is about how Jamaica understands risk in a changing climate. Whether the country chooses to anchor its survival in its own savings or in its ability to mobilize international capital quickly will shape how secure it truly is when the next disaster comes.